Brooke, at 2:01, you can start the music. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We are so incredibly excited for you to be joining us this afternoon, and grateful for the Morehouse School of Medicine National Center for Primary Care, who is hosting this important symposium. As a proud former fellow of the Satcher Health Leadership Institute, I personally know the commitment and dedication that the Morehouse community has to advance health equity and to center the voices of those experiencing various injustices. Dr. Satcher would often say to us, we need leaders who care enough, who know enough, do enough, and will persist enough, and who will persist until the job is done if we want to achieve health equity. So today's session is a personal honor for me and a special opportunity to help prepare you to know enough so that you can do enough to influence decisions across sectors to tackle the big needs caused by a legacy of systemic disinvestment in communities that we all care about. As many of you know, the federal funding made possible through the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act has provided state and local leaders with an important opportunity to reinvest in a variety of initiatives that could lead to more equitable access to and outcomes from government intervention. If these funds are invested with clear vision to address the upstream drivers of health inequity, it could really result in significant health systems transformation. However, However, there are significant dollars that have yet to be committed or obligated to any initiative. And this means that there is still an important opportunity for us, those of us in the health equity space, to direct how these funds can be spent. Our charge from the Georgia Health Policy Center to you today is to help prepare you to influence those decisions. Our session is broken up into 4 main parts. I, Japri Hemming, will share a few thoughts with you about the types of leaders that we want influencing funding decisions and some of the principles that we want you to think about as you drive those decisions. My colleague, Bill Rinscher, will do a broad overview of the American Rescue Plan Act, hopefully demystifying some of its complexity. And then finally, my colleague, Maggie Leonard, will share a resource that we've been working on that's designed to help you envision opportunities and further understand the scope of the funds made available to states for a variety of needs. After our presentations, you'll have an opportunity in small breakout groups to get familiar with the tool that we hope that you'll leverage later. Before we get too far down the road, I'd like to follow Dr. Satcher's model and find out what you're knowing and doing in this space. So we're curious, and we're going to do a little pulse check to get a sense of your current involvement with ARPA decisions. So if you could just go ahead and answer that poll, I'll be honest and say, I think I'm doing quite a bit, but I'm not really sure. So if you didn't mind, go ahead and answering the poll, and we'll see who's in the room, and we'll see our current doing activity around influencing these decisions. Michelle, if you could just let me know, and it sounds like, okay, we got about half of the folks in the room that have answered. Maybe we can all get to about 70% of the folks in the room who would have answered the poll. Okay, great. So I see from these results that there is a great opportunity. Over half of us in this room really want to be in this space, but we haven't yet stepped into it. So let me take a few moments on the next slide to motivate you and encourage you to think about ways that you might get involved. As we all know, COVID-19 really did highlight the longstanding inequities that many of us in this virtual space have been working to address in our communities and beyond for a long time. And while I am excited about the momentum around equity, we all know that advancing true health equity is really complex. So this moment really does call for thoughtfully crafted solutions that will maximize the positive impacts of these funds and reduce any negative burdens that could potentially widen health inequities. We actually saw during the COVID-19 response that some of the initiatives that came out actually increased disparity. We don't want that. So we really think that health equity leaders, those of you who are in the room today and those that you are connected and affiliated with, really are best positioned to lead through this open window of funding opportunity. So on the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more about why. Health equity leaders, as we see the world, already think in the ways, they already have the mindset that centers equity as the guiding priority. And that mindset not only centers equity, but it shapes how they act and behave. So in an ideal situation, we would just go about making everyone have our mindset of health equity and encouraging them to behave in ways that advance health equity. But we know that mindsets and actions really vary from person to person and setting to setting. So it makes it tremendously difficult to create widespread wholesale change by just intervening on how people think or act. So what we believe, based on some work that our colleagues have done at Rethink Health, is that a more practical and scalable approach is to alter the conditions that affect how people experience the world in a way that really stacks the deck toward the things we care about, for example, health equity, and for encouraging ways or new ways of thinking and doing. So when you're looking at this very chaotic image here, what we're really trying to get you to center on is that where we want you all to be influencing and making change is in those conditions, or how people are experiencing the world. That those conditions are at the intersection of a continuous loop of mindsets, or how we think, and actions, how we behave. So if we change anything about the conditions, we believe that it reinforces changes in both mindsets and actions, and that it really can travel far beyond our original point of intervention. It can extend to individuals, organizations, networks, or the larger nationwide field. And so while we know that significant shifts can sometimes occur on their own, we also encourage that health equity has to be catalyzed by interactions and intervention from change agents in those conditions that we care about. On the next slide, I'll share a little bit more with you about how those change agents that we're talking about, or what we call as stewards, or leaders who take responsibility for transforming health and well-being. The work of these stewards, from our perspective, is to really help develop the tools, provide the insights, encourage the practice that really sets up those conditions to achieve health equity and to achieve health systems transformation. So it is really our desire that stewards of equity jump into the conversation about the federal recovery funds, because you all are the people who will really make sure that this money is used in equity advancing ways. On the next slide, I'll talk to you a little bit about health systems transformation. And I keep using this phrase, and I want to be clear about what we mean. So when we think about health systems transformation, we're really talking about a system that is designed with the intention of creating well-being, equity, and racial justice. We acknowledge that historically, our well-being has really relied on systems that were never built for any of us to really thrive. And so the types of investments that we're hoping come out of the American Rescue Plan Act are those that move beyond trying to orchestrate well-being and equity in a broken system to a transformed system, a system that reimagines opportunity and positions us to best overcome the crises that we face, from legacies of past and ongoing racism in our society, bitter divisions in our public life, and fragmentation and short-sightedness in our institutions. These funds have to be used on things that are bigger than narrow programs and projects and interventions. COVID has really shown us that we really do need to encourage health systems transformation wherever possible. Health equity really does defy easy explanation and controlled intervention. And so what I'm arguing and what I'm suggesting, and what I know that you know, and I believe that you care about, is that this moment really is going to require leaders to navigate the complexity with purpose, humanity, and agility to really bring about the change to systems that can result in transformation in communities and that are designed for well-being, equity, and justice. On the next slide, I'm going to find out whether or not I have encouraged you yet enough to really get into understanding the opportunity of the American Rescue Plan Act. But before I do that, I want to know, what do you already know about the American Rescue Plan Act? So we have another quick poll, and I'm curious. I know folks on our team are going to say we know quite a bit, but there is a lot more to learn. Every time we think we've uncovered a piece of the legislation, we learn a lot more about it. I've submitted my poll, and I encourage you to do the same. And we'll close the poll right about now. Perfect. So there are a few of us in the room who really do know quite a bit about the legislation, but I think many of us are joining this session because we only know the tip of the iceberg. And so we will get into more details about the legislation. But before I turn it over to my colleague, Bill Rencher, who's going to talk to you in great detail about it, I want to just share a couple of principles that we really think would encourage reaching or advancing equity and investing in change together that can result in health systems transformation. So our team here at the Georgia Health Policy Center has been working on a project called the Aligning in Crisis that has really been trying to think about how cross-sector initiatives, health collaboratives, have been working to respond to the crisis of COVID-19, the economic downturn of 2020, and the nation's recent grappling with structural racism. And so we had been scouring, just doing lots of landscape scans to understand what had been happening. And what we found and what we saw is that those communities that already had alignment across sectors to be public health, healthcare, and social services, they were far better positioned to respond to the crisis of COVID-19. And they were far more likely to encourage investments and initiatives that were not just responding to crisis, but were a little more long-term in nature. We also saw, and we also recommend based on what we saw in the field, that those people who were really making a coordinated strategy to guide the work and the investments of the federal recovery funds were able to use them and leverage them in ways that were, again, reaching toward a more systemic change in community, as opposed to, again, just tinkering with the issues that were at the surface raised up by COVID. Another principle that we had really begun to understand and learn is that those organizations who serve as intermediaries, not only were they ready and able to assist, but they were really a part of helping to coordinate strategies and help alignment across sectors. And so as we're thinking about these investments, as we're thinking about these dollars, we really do want to encourage intermediary organizations to step up and influence the decisions around these dollars. Lastly, I'll say that what we really saw is communities who really were at the center, who were part of the co-decision models, or co-decision-making models rather, really were driving change in their communities. So I'll give a couple of examples from each of those principles, and then I'll turn it over to Bill. So we saw in, for example, Ohio, through a Pathways Communities Hub, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's an accountable health communities model that had been funded by CMMS and others. It really was helping to, in 35 communities in Ohio, coordinate strategies to address upstream barriers to health equity. And they were doing this before COVID, but they obviously did it a lot more as the COVID funding relief became available. They were leveraging their community health worker models to really understand how the community was experiencing COVID-19 and its most deleterious impacts. And then they were directing resources, and they were directing possibilities for changes in policy to better coordinate across a variety of sectors. And so we lift up and raise this model of Pathways Community Hub as one example of how we could encourage and spur cross-sector alignment while using these American Rescue Plan Act dollars to invest in systemic change. Our second principle around a coordinated strategy, we saw many states do this, but we were particularly impressed by what North Carolina was doing. It came out of the budget, the governor's budget was really providing a very detailed and coordinated statewide framework to strategically use the American Rescue Plan Act funds. And we can drop a link in the chat. But the document really set out a broad set of goals that were guiding all the spending with a clear focus on equity. And they were encouraging investments not to just be fast, but to be equitable, effective, and sustainable. Obviously, the budget is still rolling out, and the decisions around how it's being implemented, we don't know yet, but we do know that at least that's one model that we can look to that was encouraging an equitable and coordinated use of these funds. I am going to pause for a second and just spend a little time talking about intermediaries, because we really do value and think that these organizations should really be the stewards and at the fore of helping to shape these funds. So most of us on this call know that many states, counties, and cities have been challenged to move this money quickly because of a variety of reasons, to include budgetary reasons, procurement reasons, hiring regulations, other policies, and et cetera. So what we've seen some states do is turn to intermediaries. And if I haven't defined it, what we mean by that are non-governmental organizations that can work collaboratively with government to implement the goals of the funding, to raise community engagement in addressing health equity. And what we're basically commenting on is that this builds on a long time precedent that states and local jurisdictions, including health departments, have already used and have already leveraged through intermediaries. Some that you're probably familiar with, and many of you might represent on the call, local foundations, public health institutes, community health centers, and as I previously mentioned, accountable communities for health. And so there are really 4 ways that we see intermediaries being able to step into this space and to really help shape the use of these funds. And so maybe some of you are on the call in the position to influence how your organization can step up into some of these roles. One of the ways we see intermediaries really working in this space is by being a fiscal agent that can help in equitable distribution of the resources. We've seen this happen before, and we know that in instances where this is done well and with equity at the center, it really does help the money and the funds get to community-based organizations who really can drive the needle on the change we want to see. So we've seen, for example, the Rhode Island Foundation partnering with the state of Rhode Island to administer the CARES Act funding, making grants to over 100 local nonprofits. And the Rhode Island Foundation really has been stewarding even more than that. They recently have been responsible for designing the plan to spend $20 million of the COVID-19 funds that went to the state. They have been encouraging and identifying ways to braid and blend those funds with private dollars to make some of their investments and initiatives a little bit more long-term. They've also played a really critical role in setting the table of convening community leaders and organizations to really help identify the most promising investments for the state. Another way that intermediaries can really step into this space and really encourage change is through hiring and building a community workforce. We've seen this done through public health institutes. For example, in Michigan, we saw that Michigan worked through the state to leverage and identify 402 affiliates who were ultimately hired by the state health department to help in response to COVID-19 challenges, et cetera. We also believe and suggest that intermediaries can really play an important governance and administration role and really take responsibility for planning and implementing programs that can really help shape the use of these funds. We saw this happening in Lackawanna County Health Department, where they had been working with United Way and other entities to really build on that momentum and to really shape the use of the funds based on previous things that they had done at the county level. And then lastly, I'll just say that intermediaries can really play an important role in planning and establishing community priorities. Many intermediaries already set a table with community-based organizations and the community. They already play a role in planning and documenting community health assessments and community needs assessments for local jurisdictions. And so we encourage intermediaries to really step into this role. We saw this happen in Long Beach, California, where an accountable community for health has really been encouraging the City Department of Health and Human Services to really meaningfully engage residents in determining how to use and spend these funds. So we lift up all of these examples because we really do believe that these are the strategies and principles that can help us get closer to equity. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention and comment, I probably said community at least 40 times in the last 10 minutes. And that's because we really are encouraging health equity leaders to make sure that community is at the decision-making table and has really co-decision-making authority in the use and the expenditures of these funds. There is no better opportunity than now for the community to really be deciding how they want to see these massive amounts of funds invested to meet their needs and goals. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Bill, who is going to walk you through detailed insights of the legislation, help you understand how it's designed, help you understand what the components are, and then Bill will pass it to Maggie, who will give you further insights into the tool that we've built. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was muted. It might help if you could hear me and not be required to just read my lips. Good to be here today with you. My name is Bill Rencher. I'm a senior research associate with the Georgia Health Policy Center. Thank you, Jepare, for that information, for handing it over to me. I'm gonna, before I go into the details of the American Rescue Plan Act, and I have to say a caveat. When I say details about the American Rescue Plan Act, I'm not going to be going through every detail of it. I could spend a couple of hours talking about the legislation, but I want to give you kind of like a high-level overview of it. But before I get to that, I want to just talk a moment about what an unprecedented opportunity we have because of the federal funding that has been coming out as a result of the COVID pandemic and economic crisis. We've had several pieces of legislation, really 4 big pieces of legislation, and those are shown here on the slide. The CARES Act of 2020 that amounted to about 2.2 trillion dollars. That's trillion with a T. $2.2 trillion in funding. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 actually passed in December of 2020. This was really the appropriations bill to run the government, to fund the government for the next year, but they added on to it about $1 trillion in additional spending in response to the COVID crisis. The CARES Act funding and the Consolidated Appropriations Act funding are pretty much, that's all been spent. And so what we're really talking about today is the American Rescue Plan Act, which was passed in March of 2021. It comes to about $1.9 trillion in funding for various purposes, mostly to respond to the pandemic and the economic crisis, but there's some other stuff in it as well, which I'll get to in a moment. And then we also had the bipartisan infrastructure plan, which was passed, I believe, last fall. But don't quote me on that. And that came to $1.2 trillion. And this is really more for traditional infrastructure like roads and bridges. It's not really about public health. There's a few things in it that kind of touch on public health, but what we're really talking about right now and what the big issue is the American Rescue Plan Act. And then what we've done on this slide is to kind of put this in context. The dotted lines going from left to right show how this funding compares with previous kind of high levels of government spending. We had the Tobacco Master Settlement in the late 1990s that came to a little over $200 billion. The New Deal of the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. If we looked at that in today's dollars, it's about $800 billion that was spent. Now, one caveat to that is that the population of the United States was about half of what it is now back in the 1930s. So that sort of explains why it may seem a little low, but still, the funding that we're talking about because of COVID and the economic crisis is much greater than these. Finally, the Great Recession is also shown on here from 2008, which was about $900 billion in economic stimulus funding, the bank bailouts, et cetera. So we really are talking about an unprecedented amount of federal funding flowing to states, local governments, community organizations, public health, et cetera. Next slide, please. So what's in the American Rescue Plan Act? We've put this into kind of 6 big buckets. It's a total of $1.9 trillion, as I mentioned, divided up into 217 sections of legislation. Because I'm merciful, I'm not going to go through all 217 sections of that legislation for you. But looking at it in these kind of 6 big buckets, we've got $411 billion in direct payments to Americans. Maybe you got a stimulus check last year. That's where that came from, was from the American Rescue Plan Act, from this kind of category. $362 billion in aid to state, local, and tribal governments. Most of this is what's known as the state and local fiscal recovery funds, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. $203 billion for expansion of unemployment benefits, $176 billion in tax incentives, $174 billion in public health spending, and $170 billion in education support. And then there's also about $130 billion for other programs that don't fit neatly into one of these 6 categories. Next slide, please. This chart, if you will, I'm not sure what to call it, I'm going to call it a chart. This chart shows how those funds, well, it shows how those funds are flowing through different federal agencies. These are the federal agencies with responsibility over these funds, with responsibility over distributing them, spending them. And the agency that has the most influence over this is the Department of the Treasury. That's the red that takes up the left, more than the left side of this chart. And a lot of that is because the state and local fiscal recovery funds. The smaller squares on here show what agency or some other entity that those funds pass through as well. And for example, here within the Department of the Treasury, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, is the biggest agency with responsibility. And a big part of their responsibility is writing the rules for reporting. They're in charge of the tax incentive programs. And actually the IRS and the whole Treasury Department has been very, very busy this year. And you may have seen a delay in getting your tax refund. That's why. And I think the federal government in general is a bit short-staffed right now, but especially the Treasury Department and the IRS. And then that's followed by the Department of Labor, Department of Education. The orange up in the upper right is Health and Human Services and other agencies. But the money is flowing through a lot of different federal agencies. That doesn't mean that these federal agencies like the Treasury Department are keeping all this money for themselves. It just means they have responsibility over it. And it's then going out to states, counties, or perhaps other agencies within the department. Next slide, please. So the state and local fiscal recovery funds, this is a substantial portion of the American Rescue Plan Act. It's the part that most likely has the biggest impact on you and your organizations. And it's a great deal of money, as you can see on this slide. There is $219 billion for the states. That's for all 50 states and the District of Columbia. $65.1 billion for all counties in the United States. That includes the parishes of Louisiana, the boroughs of Alaska, all counties getting $65.1 billion. Metropolitan cities, which the law defines as having a population of 50,000 or more, those cities will be getting $45.6 billion all total. The city of Atlanta is a metropolitan city, Chicago, New York, but 50,000 is not that much. So some cities like Gainesville, Florida, for example, might be considered a metropolitan city and getting that funding. These first three on here, the states, the counties, and the large cities, will be getting this money directly from the Treasury Department. The last category on here, non-entitlement units. This is a fancy name for small cities and towns. These are municipalities, whatever you want to call them, whether it's a city, a town, a village, a township, a hamlet, that have less than 50,000 people. These units of government will be getting their money from their state. So that $19.5 billion that is for all of these small towns and cities, that money is being distributed to the states where those cities are, and then the state has to give that money to those small towns and cities. And that's in addition to the money at the top here that the state is getting for their state fiscal recovery fund. Next slide. What can this money be used for? There are really three kind of big categories: aid to households, small businesses, nonprofit organizations, and impacted industries like especially tourism, hospitality, and travel. The airline industry has been hit pretty hard by COVID. I think they're finally coming out of that, but there's money for them, money for small businesses like restaurants, businesses that have been really negatively impacted by the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis. The money can also be used to fund government services that had to be cut back because of decreased tax revenue during the pandemic. And then third, the money can also be used to make necessary investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The first two categories here, and most of the stuff in the bill, even beyond the state and local recovery funds, is about responding to the pandemic and responding to the economic crisis. This last bullet here doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with COVID or the economic crisis. If your city or your state, for that matter, has this giant water project that they want to do, there may be funding for that, and that money can be used for that. Same with broadband, sewer, et cetera. One caveat is that there's a couple, but the biggest one is that governments cannot use this money to shore up pension funds for their employees. That's one thing that it cannot be used for. Next slide, please. The Treasury Department, which is in charge of the state and local recovery funds, they have been putting out a lot of guidance, some final rules about the money, informal guidance as well. And these are quotations just from some of the guidance they've put out. And I really want to point out the first two here, addressing the systemic public health and economic challenges that may have contributed to more severe impacts of the pandemic among low-income communities and people of color. And then the second quote from another piece of guidance: the Treasury Department encourages the use of funds that promote strong, equitable growth, including racial equity. So right from the beginning, there has been an emphasis in using this funding to address inequities in our society, to contribute to more equity around health, around racial equity, and to make sure that whatever growth, economic growth, comes out of this money is done equitably. And then there's also stuff about administrative costs, transparency, having to have a public-facing website. Next slide, please. And then just some more information about, more guidance about, the reporting requirements. I will mention that as far as reporting requirements go, on that chart that had those four different kind of entities, the states, counties, big cities, small cities, The reporting requirements get less onerous as you go down that list. So the states have the most reporting requirements, and the small towns and cities have the least amount of reporting requirements. And I won't go through the rest here. You'll be provided with these slides after the session, so you can have this as a resource. On this last slide here, the point I want to make is that we live in the United States is a federalist system. The states and the federal government share power. They have power over different things. And then the states are free to, within some parameters, to set up their own forms of government. And some state governments, for example, some states have really strong governors. Some states have really weak governors. Some states have strong legislatures, others not so much. And when it comes to ARPA decisions at the state level, this varies as to who has the authority to do what. Most states, 34 here, the legislative branch and the executive branch have authority over how these funds are spent. But there are 8 states where the executive branch, the governor's office, has exclusive authority over deciding how it's going to be spent. 6 states where the legislature has exclusive authority, and then 2 states where it's not really specified who has the authority and who doesn't, or if they share it. So it's complicated. And I would also point out that how a state spends those funds for that purpose, there's a lot of leeway in that too. A state like Georgia, for example, has put out a request for proposals for organizations to apply for funding to carry out the purpose of those allocations. But Georgia didn't have to do that. A state doesn't have to do that. They could do it all on their own. So whether or not funding might be available to your organization will depend on where you live, not just what state you're in, but the counties and the cities have that power as well to decide how they're going to spend the money. Will they do it alone? Will they need partner organizations? So where you are, you might have an opportunity to take part in this, to receive funding, or you may not. That just kind of depends. It's different everywhere. And so our purpose today is not really to tell you what you need to do to get this money, to get some of this money. We can't really answer that question because it's different everywhere. But what we want to do today is give you a taste, not just a taste, but we want to show you this tool where you can at least determine how much money is coming either to your community or for your category of service or purpose, and then go about on your own investigating, contacting those agencies or counties or states or whoever, and finding out if funding is available, if you could partner, and then finding out through them what you might have to do to get that money. So with that, I will now hand it back over to Japare, who I think is going to conduct our next poll.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. Actually, we've decided we will skip our next poll, and I am an invisible talking head. There I am. We will skip the poll, and before we just get into the demonstration of the dashboard and the tool that we've built, we wanted to make sure that you all have an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have about what we've presented, anything that Bill or I have said, or any ideas that are kind of sparked in your head as you're listening to these 2 presentations. And I believe the easiest way to jump into the conversation is by using the raise hand feature, and then it'll put you at the top so that we can see to call on you and unmute you. Hi, Megan, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. What is your sense as far as the kind of state and local decision makers and their understanding and comfort levels with making these decisions? I just feel like there's so much money, there's so many decisions that can and can't be made. Do you get the sense that they have a plan in place? Are they flying by the seat of their pants? You know, what is happening at that level?
I'll choose to answer this based on some of the research that we've done. We have used some resources available through the National League of Cities, as well as through the National Council of State Legislatures, to look at what bills have been proposed and passed related to this funding. What we found is that while there are some that really are making progress in those places where, for example, they have been investing in health equity for a long time, where their infrastructure is in place to really receive and move money quickly, we've seen that there is quite a bit that is happening. But what I will say, and this is why we're so excited about the opportunity here, is that there are many, many more states, counties, and cities who have not yet made decisions. And the variety of things that we're hearing are some that I mentioned already. We don't have the infrastructure to really take in this massive amount of money. When my colleague Maggie does the demonstration of the dashboard, and you really see the sheer magnitude of money that can be coming to a county, a city, or a non-entitlement unit, there are times when the state and local fiscal relief money eclipses their entire operating budget for a year. And so I would say to you that it varies greatly, but I would suggest that many people and many states, many counties, many localities need a lot of help to influence how these funds are spent and the decisions that are being made. So I would be cautious not to suggest that there is not a lot of movement, but I would submit to you that you'd be surprised at how hard it is to make decisions about the funds because of their sheer magnitude. Bill or Maggie, did you have other thoughts that you wanted to add to my reaction?
I was just going to say that it varies, and some states. I've done some research a little while ago, trying to get some information for another project that I'm on about I was really looking for state websites about ARPA funding. And not to brag about my own state, but Georgia has, if you Google Georgia OPB, that's Office of Planning and Budget, ARPA, you'll find that the Georgia Office of Planning and Budget has a whole website all about ARPA funding, opportunities available, etc. But you could do the same, look for the same thing in other states and find nothing. It just varies. And it is, I think, a bit overwhelming, and it is pretty resource intensive for a lot of states and local governments.
And I just wanted to say that my colleague, Alicia Casey McCall, asked if I could share some of those examples that I commented on during my presentation. And I'm gonna drop a link for everybody in the chat. We have a couple of briefs about these different ways to function as an intermediary or influence those decisions. I will tell you that the intermediary brief is like 5 hours from being published. So if it's not there when you go, it will be there soon. But you can go to that website, alignforhealth.org/crisis, and see a lot of the examples that I mentioned on today's call. Any other questions before we get into the demonstration? Okay, Maggie, I think that it might be a great time for us to show the resource.
Hey, everyone. I'm going to share one more slide, and then I will show you what we've been working on. So let me just share my screen just to give you a little bit of context for what we've been doing. So in 2020, the Georgia Health Policy Center started a project in conjunction with the George Washington University and with support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation called Aligning in Crisis. And what we wanted to know was what innovations were being developed during what we were calling the triple crisis. So that's the pandemic, structural racism, and the economic downturn. We were wondering what these innovations were doing to address disparities in health equity as those issues had really risen to the surface. We were specifically interested in learning more about cross-sector innovations because we understand that people have complex needs and that they need all of those needs to be addressed and able to thrive and to really live a healthy life. So when the American Rescue Plan Act was passed, we saw an opportunity to further fund these innovations. But many of our partners were very confused about how to harness these funds. So in thinking about the legislation and how the allocations of money could be used, we wanted to try and stress these cross-sector opportunities. And one way we thought about doing that was in coding the legislation according to the social determinants of health. We felt like this language was familiar to our partners and that it might help them further the goals that they had in mind, and to really start to see this money outside of the silos of each individual federal department. So what we created is a website called Funding Resilience, Advancing Multi-Sector Investments for Equity. And it contains a synthesis not only of the legislation itself, but we looked further at information on the federal department websites, grants.gov, and other third-party resources, namely the ones that Japre mentioned earlier from the National League of Cities and the National Council of State Legislatures. So we're hoping that this website will help you and others to visualize and think strategically about ARPA funding and to leverage this funding to address the multitude of conditions across sectors that impact health equity. We have interactive visualizations on this dashboard, which I'm about to show you, and they're designed to help users think about the legislation maybe in new ways. Though if people have particular projects already in mind, then we have filters and tools to help them access that money. So let me stop sharing my screen for just a moment as I transition over to the website itself. Christina, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you see the website? Thank you so much. So this first page is really an overview here. Again, we were looking for interactive ways of looking at the legislation. So here we have two tree maps. One of them that shows the different social determinants of health. There are 5 of them. Economic stability, neighborhood and built environment, education access and quality, healthcare access and quality. And you can see right here, I think it's community, social and community context. And then we have all of the different federal departments that have money allocated to them to disperse for sometimes very specific needs, sometimes for less specific needs, all through the American Rescue Plan Act. If you were to click on one like neighborhood and built environment, you would see that of the funds that we have tracked, 382 billion of them can go to address the social determinant of health. And down here below, there are 8 different departments, all of which have money that could try and meet this need. If you hover over it, you'll get a little bit more information about who those administrators might be if the department sends it to agencies within the department and how much money that is. And so you can kind of look around and get a sense. I suspect many people don't necessarily think of the Department of Homeland Security being a part of that neighborhood and built environment, social determinant of health, but there are ways in which we think that they can really contribute to meeting these conditions and needs. So this is just our overview page, starting to play around with some of the visualizations. If you're interested in which parts of the legislation are oriented toward that social determinant of health, you can go here to our detailed overview of the investment opportunities. You'll see the same tree map as we had before. So again, maybe you would choose neighborhood and built environment. And down below, our table filters so that these are all of the different sections from the legislation that we think pertain to neighborhood and built environment. If you hover your mouse over it, again, you can get a little bit more information, not only the section title name on the table, but then you can see what the purpose is and how long the money will remain available. And if you're curious about how we have coded this information, all of the filters are listed down below. If you are working on a specific project, maybe you know exactly what you're looking at, you can go over here to topics of interest and filter them according to whatever you might be interested in. So perhaps you're interested in behavioral and mental health. So if you click on that, you get a list of all of the behavioral and mental health related pieces of the parts of the legislation. And you can see that there are about 6 or so different agencies that are all handling that money separately as they try and get it out into communities. Part of what Bill talked about was the state and local fiscal recovery funds, which is where we see it's one particular section of the legislation where there's the most flexibility. And as you said, this money can be used to address the negative economic impact. It can be for essential workers, for government services, excuse me, or for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And we have 4 different pots of money there, as he explained. So you have money that goes to the states, the counties, the cities, and the non-entitlement units. One of the things that we found in our research was there wasn't really one place where we could see how that money worked across jurisdictions. And we know that some people are interested in working across jurisdictions. So if you lived in a place like Atlanta, you might be interested in working with DeKalb County and Cobb County and Fulton County and the city of Atlanta, and maybe some smaller cities or non-entitlement units like Alpharetta or Decatur. So down here, these totals up here kind of default to adding up everything in the tables below, and this is the grand total. You could go down here and click on, say, perhaps Arizona, and now you have only the counties, cities, and non-entitlement units that are in Arizona. If you highlight some of the different counties, or perhaps cities, or non-entitlement units, the dashboard will automatically total those specific places and give you the grand total for the amount of money that is available. So we're really trying to help people to think not only in terms of the social determinants of health, but across jurisdictions, and to get a real sense of the amount of money that is headed to those different places. We have 2 more dashboards. The state and local, or the state snapshot of verified funds. So all of the different federal departments on occasion will tell you where they've sent the money to. They don't always keep it in-house at the federal level. Sometimes they'll divvy up that money to the various states, sending it out, or maybe even sending out grants, and they'll put that information out on their websites. So these are where we know exactly how much the state has received outside of the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So perhaps you are interested in money that was going over here to Nebraska. You could click on Nebraska, and now you have a dozen more funds, and we know exactly how much is going to each of those different agencies. So again, maybe you're interested in the behavioral health one again. It's up here at the top. So if you click it, now you know very specifically that in Nebraska, they're getting another $3 billion, excuse me, for behavioral and mental health funds that are going to their state. Again, hovering on the dollar amount will give a little menu that shows you what the purpose of that money is for, which department has that money, so that if you were to look for these things in your own locality, you would know where to begin looking. The final part of the dashboard that we have is this notice of funding opportunity. We have found that grants.gov, while wonderful in so many ways, can be a little cumbersome to navigate. So again, we have taken all of the grants that are associated with the American Rescue Plan Act. We've added them to our own database and coded them according to social determinant of health. So in clicking on these buttons here at the top, it should show you what is available, or you might find the topic of interest over here on the side and get a list of grants that you or people you know could apply for. We also have the link that takes you directly to the website. So again, purpose, who's eligible for these funds, about how much might they expect to be awarded, and then the link that goes out to grants.gov in case you would like to try and apply. So I'm going to stop sharing there for just a moment. So at this point, our hope was that we might give you the opportunity to engage with the dashboard and maybe try it out according to a case study. So I'm going to share my screen one last time with maybe one of two more times with a case study written on it that I thought maybe we could all explore. Jepre, would you mind going ahead and dropping the dashboard link into the chat so that everyone can use it? It's framingfunds.org if you're quicker than she is. I am sharing my screen again. Christina, can you give me another thumbs up if you see the Chicago slide? Okay, great. So I'll just read through this. Thank you, Michelle, as well. Feel free to read it on your own, but this lays out some of the type of information that you might have if you were trying to look for funds in your own community. I'm going to give more of some broad sweeps over this. So in Chicago, in response to the COVID pandemic, they decided to start a contact tracing corps. So the mayor was able to find some funding for this, at least in its initial stages, and worked in collaboration with various universities across the city, as well as the Mount Sinai Urban Health Institute. And we're working with, I believe, some of their own health departments within the city in hopes of hiring 600 people for newly created jobs. They were looking to hire people from communities of high economic hardship that had been negatively impacted by COVID-19 and training them how to become contact tracers in hopes that this would help propel these individuals into public health careers. They would give them tools there was a need for in that moment, and that these things could continue on in the future. So as one of the innovations that we found and we were really interested and impressed with, we took it as an example of what is a new program that might be looking to find money to sustain itself post-pandemic, and that they might be able to draw upon the American Rescue Plan Act money to do so. We have some key geographies listed here. Cook County, DeKalb, DuPage, Grundy, Kane, Kendall, Lake, McHenry, and Will. Those are all counties in the greater Chicago area. And then a number of the cities and even suburbs for that area, such as Arlington Heights, Chicago Heights, Aurora. These are all names that we've heard. So we wanted to see and give you the opportunity to play around with our dashboard and see if you could figure out how much money might be available to fund this initiative. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to the American Rescue Plan Act. And I'm also,
while you're doing that, Maggie, I was just going to say that this part of the presentation is a little bit interactive. And so Maggie's going to ask you some questions, and we're going to talk about some topical areas so that we can, in real time, try to use the dashboard to sort through opportunities to use these funds for our interest.
and this is a little, well, I'm not sure exactly how this will go, but I am going to copy and paste into the chat. If nothing else, having those geographic areas could be helpful. Nope, it doesn't want me to do that. It's too much. Okay, I'm going to reshare my screen so that we are back on our dashboard. And I would love to invite you all to consider with me. Oh, dashboard 2, there we go. Who might be involved in what details could we filter for this particular example? So knowing that this is in the Chicago area, so if we know that the thing that I just read you talked a little bit about who the partners were for this particular case study. So what jurisdiction are we operating from? Is this federal? Are we looking for funds that might be available to localities? Are we interested in funds that would be available to states, territories, or tribes? So for Chicago, which eligibility should we be honing in on? And I cannot see the chat. So if anything pops up in the chat, if Japre, if you would help with that, I would appreciate it.
Sure, no problem.
Maybe I can get it.
So just for the group, Maggie, when you say locality, does that mean a city or a county to you?
That's a great question. Yes. So the federal definition for locality is any city, town, county, or the non-entitlement units.
Okay. Well, I would assume it's going to be the locality then, since you mentioned that it was City of Chicago. And while you're doing that, I'm also going to just go ahead and drop the PDF of the case study in the chat. So maybe if someone wants to read it.
Oh, thank you.
Along, that might help.
That's really helpful. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that locality is a great choice. I would also choose other. For us, other means something like a business or a nonprofit that isn't a part of a government jurisdiction, but might be eligible for funds. And then we've already filtered it down a little bit there. And then thinking about the eligible recipients. So you'll remember that there were universities that were a part of this innovation. So I'm going to choose organizations and other. We also had kind of the mayor and the public health department. So I'm going to choose department here as well. And I'm going to choose agency just in case, because I think there were some kind of government agencies that were trying to engage this, but we didn't really have any for-profit businesses, and we didn't really have any individuals. This wasn't like getting the checks in the mail or any kind of tax break. So we've already whittled it down a little bit. And then I might use the topic of interest to try and figure out what funds might be available for a contact tracing core. And we have a number of different things. So if you're on your own computer and looking at this list, please feel free to drop in the chat or shout out if there are any of these different topics that you might think would lead us towards the money for the COVID contact tracing core in Chicago. I think that COVID-19 monitoring and response might be one. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect all and select that one, but we can choose multiple if we like. I suspect that health systems might be one. and workforce, and since this is a little bit workforce development.
I think it might be a little bit challenging for people to read your screen. So that's probably why they're a little reluctant to shout them out. So if you just kind of walk us through how to think through it, I think that'd be great.
Okay. And then the last one that I think I'll choose for right now is public health. Those all seem like they're right up our alley. So we have this list of, I don't know, maybe 24 or so. I think it looks almost like 24 different funds, and not all of them are going to apply to us. So for example, funding for SARS-CoV-2 genomic sequencing and surveillance, that's not going to be quite at the level as we are for the contact tracers. But I do think, let's see here, that funding for COVID-19 testing, contact tracing, and mitigation activities might be one that's helpful. So there is $47 million available there nationally. So if I click on it, it should adjust things up top so we can get a running total of how much money we're able to harness. Another one that I think might be interesting is this economic adjustment assistance. This is for COVID-19 prevention, preparation, and response for expenses and economic injury. I'm not really sure what that means, but maybe that would be something that we would want to look at later. So if I press, I'm on a Mac, so I press Command, PCs would press Control. You can highlight multiple of them. And again, it adjusts the amount of money that we have up at the top. There's funding for public health workforce down here. I'm going to go ahead and highlight that one. And where else? Oh, go away, little bubble. We might also be able to use maybe funding for education and awareness campaign encouraging healthy work conditions. Contact tracers might be in contact with employers. So with just those 4 funds from this list, we have over $58 billion that might be able to be harnessed. So I would then be interested in knowing whether or not any of these funds are available at the local level in my state. So you might go over to the state snapshots of verified funds page. We have about 50 funds in here of that 217 lines of legislation that Bill discussed earlier. So they're not all going to be in here. But one of the things that we can do is type in. So one of them that we found before was, let's pick Illinois first. So that'll filter it down so we only see Illinois. And then I might be interested in seeing if there's any funding for the public health workforce. So I can type that into the section title here, which is the title that we saw on the last page. You could also go ahead and use the filters just like we used previously, the topic interest or the eligibility filters. Excuse me, I don't know why I'm stumbling. And here you see that we do in fact have almost $115 million going to Illinois for public health workforce. So that's money that this organization might be able to tap into. It might be interesting to take a look and see if there is anything for the funding for COVID-19 testing. So I could type that in here. And it looks like we have a rural health clinic COVID-19 testing and mitigation, but unfortunately, Chicago is not rural, so these funds probably wouldn't apply for them. But it gives you a sense of being able to see and trace down those concrete numbers when we know them. And then the final place that one might go is the state and local fiscal recovery funds, and again, clicking on Illinois, you could go through here and see how much money was going to that particular area. So we might not be interested in the funds here. So I might click none selected there. So that turns my total here to 0. But Cook County, I know, is the main county for Chicago. And you could go over here and pick out Chicago. And I think we saw that Aurora might be nearby. So we could pick that. I think I said Arlington Heights earlier. And so you get these running totals at the top of money that you might be able to work across those jurisdictions. And you can pick as many or a few of these different cities, counties, or NEUs as you like to try and get that money to work together. I think that's about it. I think I've talked entirely too much, but that gives you a taste of how one might use the dashboard for a particular project that you have in mind, or how you might be able to explore it. And one of the last things that I'd really just like to hit home here momentarily, as I jump back to screen sharing one last time, is that this dashboard is really meant to show the potential for how the American Rescue Plan Act funds might be used, but there's still a whole lot of work to be done. Particularly when trying to harness the state and local fiscal recovery funds, you will have to talk with governing officials to help them understand how these funds could be used in new and innovative ways. And to Bill's point, each and every single state, city, and county has a different way of allocating the funds that are going directly to them. So we really have to work and build a relationship to try and help influence those decisions. There are a lot of people who do not understand where this money is infusing our communities, and they'll need to be educated about where and how these funds can be leveraged. Using the social determinants of health filters on our website, it might help you to consider new strategic ways of approaching your important work, of seeing what other agencies or bodies might be involved with solving some of the problems that you're solving. So we encourage you to use this tool to help you look across silos and to consider new partnerships within your local communities. Maybe there are other nonprofits or types of institutions that could leverage these funds. And if you work together, you could take the funds that much further. And as I said, the government is still releasing information about how they're sending this money out into our communities. And so we will continue to be updating our own website, as I know some of our partners will be. So staying abreast of new information, what money has already been spoken for and what is still yet to be harnessed will be crucial for moving this forward. And we thank you so much for your time and your participation here with us. Jepre, did you want to say anything as we kind of close out our time together, or maybe we should create more space for questions? I defer to you.
I think that'd be a great idea. We recognize the complexity of the dashboard and the complexity of the funding. And so if you've had a chance to poke around the website and you're like, how do I do this? Or how do I do that? Or any thoughts that you have or questions you have about what we've presented here today and how you might use the dashboard, we'd love a chance to entertain them as we have about 10 minutes left in our session. Okay, great. Well, we really want to reiterate that this conversation has really been to help you know more so that you can do more related to influencing these funding decisions. We would be very happy if you needed one-on-one individual consultation. We'd be very happy to take your questions, to help you explore the dashboard, to help you at least brainstorm some ways that you may be able to get into action about the funds. We might not have very many specific details into your local context, but we do have details into I should say, an overview of what's happening across the nation. So yes, Anne, we would love to do that. I believe our contact information is written here, but I will go ahead and Maggie and Bill, if you don't mind, I'd go ahead and drop our emails in the chat. We have a program called Aligning Federal Funds that is really meant to build up the capacity to do what we've been sharing with you all today. And so you're absolutely welcome to reach out to us for that type of consultation. We have generous funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so we'd be happy to offer those services to you in a technical assistance capacity. If there are no other questions, we are happy to turn you over back to the remainder of the Health Equity Summit Symposium. We hope that something we've said today has inspired you to learn more about the American Rescue Plan Act. And really, we really do beg of you, those of you, because we know your commitment to health equity, we really do beg of you to seize this moment and shape these funds in ways that really can transform our communities. Our time is now, the moment is now, the momentum is here. The massive amounts of funding is available. And I really hope that we can use this moment to the best of our ability to achieve outcomes that we really care about. Thank you so much from the Georgia Health Policy Center, as well as George Washington University, our partners in this endeavor. And thank you again to Morehouse School of Medicine for this opportunity. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you to our speakers. We appreciate this session. It was a great session. For all of our attendees, I put in the chat the website to navigate to the agenda page to join our closing session. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.